You strong.
The girl joyfully jumps up and raises her hand in the air. She tells Andreas that she will be busy with the exams starting tomorrow. The sky above the academy is already getting darker. The sun is almost over the horizon. It's getting gloomy. The electronic scoreboard reports that there are 14 days, 21 hours, and 33 minutes left until Angela Lucifer evolves. Angela also lies behind the bars, shackled in chains. Her eyes are full of emptiness and despair. The girl is lying there thinking what she did. Her whole body is aching and guttural. She is shrouded in a purple haze. But she feels that there is something more to this pain. A fast orange train is passing through a tunnel. The teacher's stern voice says that when they reach the exam location, the students need to all gather together so he can explain how it will be administered. Andreas is sitting in a wagon. He has a black bag in his lap and a book in his hands. He is concentrating on the fact that people don't want Lucia to be able to pass the first exam. He looks up at the tall golden tower. It's all shimmering with gold glitter. It looks very mesmerizing. The teacher says that after this, the last part will take place in this magic tower. Andreas reminisces about how hard he's been practicing. He tells himself that he practiced a lot, so his necromancy and sword skills have grown considerably. Looking up from his potions book, he reassures himself and says that everything will be fine if he can pass his exams. He realizes that the vampire's evolution is complete, so maybe we should check on her. She's still in Karen's custody. Students are sitting in the carriage. Andreas is sitting among them. He is thinking about the fact that if he makes an excuse when he gets back, he can go and check on the vampire girl. Across from him sits a black-haired girl. A girl with a bow on her head asks a black-haired girl about what she thinks the exams will be like this time. She says with a satisfied face that the task and the composition of the group will be random, so if you're lucky it will be easy. The girl with black hair says she doesn't care who they put her with. It doesn't matter to her. The girl with the bow tie takes her by the shoulder and says that even in such a matter, she is a model student, covering her mouth with the palm of her hand so no one can hear what she's saying. She whispers in the black-haired girl's ear that it's not that simple. The black-haired girl doesn't understand what he means. She points a finger at Andreas and asks what happens if she gets in the same group as him. Andreas puts his book in his briefcase. His physical condition had gotten much better. His body began to show relief. His arms became more pumped. His chest became wider. Here the girl with black hair rounds her eyes wide and realizes that this is a scenario she had not even considered. Suddenly, the teacher's voice is heard, informing them that they are arriving at the Auckland training station in 1 minute. The train stops and the teacher tells everyone to go to the exit. The students got out of the train car. The rest get out, including the teacher. Everyone stands and waits eagerly to see what the teacher will say and what the assignment will be. They stopped outside the Auckland training station. The teacher talked about how, as previously reported, the third-year exams would be a group assignment with random members of the group. The teacher looks at the sheet and says that each group will consist of 3 students from the warrior branch, 1 student from the mage branch, and a mentor. All the students are mesmerized listening to what he's saying. The groups have until tomorrow to complete the assignment they have received. He wishes good luck to everyone involved. The building looks a little gloomy. It has a typical design. The announcement of the bands begins. It's a sunny day. There is not a single cloud in the sky, only snow-white clouds. Andreas realizes that something unpleasant awaits next. There are an odd number of villains at the academy, except for him and Karen, and in this exam, 2 of them are in his group. All of the students are looking at the teacher. They are waiting to finally announce who they will be in a group with. In the group with Andreas, the first player is the cult-fighting fanatical Hazar Gapri. The second player is the Academy's indiscriminate assassin, the crazy Vivian. Andres holds up the participant sheet for group number 9, where his members are listed. He wonders why he is in the same group with them. Resenting his luck as a bad character, someone suddenly calls out to him. He turns around and sees a guy from his band standing in front of him. A guy with blue hair stands in front of him. He introduces himself as Christopher and informs him that he is in the same group with him. He looks arrogantly at Andreas and says that he seems to be training as a warrior, even though he is a mage. Andreas wonders why he has such aggression towards him. Just then, a guy walks up to them and smiles. He waves his hand and introduces himself as Hazar Gapri. Behind him stands a girl who is also a member of their future team, Vivian. Fanatic Hazar smiles at everyone all the time. He has a happy expression on his face. He talks about how he thinks being an unfriendly warrior is a bad thing. Standing behind her, a girl with a disgruntled face introduces herself as Vivian Belcag. Her lips tighten. She thinks they're fucked up guys. Christopher asks Hazard who else isn't friendly. He tries to show with his hand that he doesn't mean that. Andreas concludes that there is even a bandit-like knight in this group. Andreas turns to Christopher and asks him why he should leave alone a mage copying warrior training. He replies that he doesn't mind everyone needing a little exercise. That's when the handler comes up and talks about them not fighting. Their problems do not end in this group. Andreas looks indignantly at her handler. She stands leaning against the wall and spits. She has a cigarette in her hands. Andreas wonders why they also have a bull on their handler. The curator looks at his team and says he thinks about it being his worst group. Some amount of time passes, and the teacher says that since all the members of the group have gathered, the group can get their assignment. He asks everyone to try to come back alive. Andreas's team is assembled. On the face of it, they seem completely different, unsuitable for each other. But Andreas has high hopes that they will succeed. There are doubts that he will be able to come back alive with such a group. A black train filled with students heading off somewhere at high speed. In the carriage sits a woozy curator, smoking a cigarette and introducing herself as Claire, the curator of the 9th group. Christopher sits next to her and looks at his mentor with shock. Claire pulls out a piece of paper and points it at the students. They stare questioningly. The sheet says they need to investigate the village in Baron Bolleric's territories. Rumor has it that the landowner of the village, Trim, has been murdered. An investigator was sent 2 weeks ago, but he too has disappeared. An investigation by the Mercenary Guild is needed. Claire looks arrogantly at a group of her students and asks if they have any questions. An indifferent Andreas thinks about how it is much more interesting compared to the game. Behind him, Hazar Gapri sits and smiles. A girl with short yellow hair and fiery eyes stands leaning on a huge golden sword. She is the soon-to-be Stent Master of Aura, and no further information about her is known. A girl sits at a computer monitor that shows Claire's persona. The girl thinks her skills are decent, but she's afraid her persona will complicate things. The curator turns to Christopher and, referring to Andreas, says that she heard that the algae head was trying to play knight the other day. Claire looks overconfident. She turns to Andreas and asks him about the fact that can he even pull his weight. Andreas confusedly replies that he doesn't want to hear this from someone who needs to chew on bits of jerky dried in special conditions to stay calm. She replies to him that she's not allowed to smoke in here, and asks him if he wants her to start chewing on him instead. Hazar Gapri, sitting next to Andreas, chuckled. Andreas is only thinking about getting here soon. The castle rises majestically above the village. A road leads to the castle, bounded on both sides. The sun is beginning to appear in the sky. Andreas and his team approach the castle, walking along the road. Ivy's curator remarks that this castle is very huge for a baron. Baron Bollerick is sitting in a chair and addresses the students. He says that they have come a long way. He looks thoughtful. The curator sits across from him. A table is set up with various sweets on it. Ivy turns to the Baron and says that the situation is tragic, however. The Baron wants to explain briefly what happened. A butler stands to the left and silently observes the guests. He begins his story by saying that the landowner of this village called Trim is his nephew. He was a baronet, but he had no family. A cup and saucer into which aromatic coffee is poured stands on the edge of the table. He reports that this is all the information he has. He has a look of hopelessness in his eyes. The curator scrutinizes a piece of paper on which important notes have been jotted down. He thanks the Baron for providing them with the details. Andreas stands with his hands folded beside the curator. His butler approaches the Baron and addresses him. He whispers something in his ear. There is still an untouched mug of coffee and a sugar bowl on the table. The butler whispers the phrase "young master" to him, and you can't hear the rest. His gaze is a bit frightened and slightly wary. The Baron's gaze depicts surprise when he heard what the butler whispered to him. At that moment, the Baron looks at Andreas. Andreas stands behind them with a nonchalant face, his arms folded across his chest. Andrea suspected it was about him. He narrows his eyes and has no idea what it's about. The Baron coughed slightly and squinted his eyes with his hand to his mouth. He was thinking about something. The curator also continues to study what is written on the piece of paper, the others standing behind her. Andreas stands distantly away from them. The Baron turns to them, saying at the same time that he needs to get down to business. The butler, dressed in a vest, bowed his head to them, saying at the same time that he was apologizing for their rudeness and informing them that the young gentleman was not well. Ivy's handler says it's okay, that they've gotten all the parts they need and will be on their way soon. She waves her hand. The butler looks suspiciously at Andreas. His gaze is filled with anger, his lips tight. Andreas turns to the butler and wonders why he is looking at him like that. He felt uncomfortable. The sky becomes peach-colored. There is not a single cloud in the sky. Ivy's handler and his team leave the building where they talk to the Baron. Outside, Christopher is waiting for them. Ivy's handler turns to him and tells him that he has done a good job keeping track of the uniforms. Ivy's handler pulls her sword out of its sheath and is suspicious that the Baron is too calm, though. He has a nephew missing. She suspects something is amiss. Ivy's handler continues to examine her steel sword while turning to Andreas. She asks him about why he insisted they go immediately. Andreas answers her that yes, he thought a lot of things were suspicious. Andreas was particularly suspicious of the part about the missing investigators with whom communication had broken down. It sounded like a fabricated story. The curator looks at him carefully and listens to what he says. A memory flashes through Andreas's mind. He recalls the face of the Baron and his butler. It was strange that they had sent investigators only once, even though a whole month had passed. But the most suspicious, he thought, was the butler's behavior. He recalls that the butler turned to the curator and said he would probably get there before nightfall. The butler says it would be better for them to rest tonight and set out tomorrow. His gaze is filled with an incomprehensible anger, and he is too serious. Ivy's handler addresses him and tells him that it's nice that they're concerned about them, but they shouldn't be. That work comes first. Andreas remembers the look in the butler's eyes. He is furious, and he is very angry about something. Andreas recalls that after. They refused to stay. The butler had a look as if his plan had failed. Andreas thought they looked very anxious. Their demeanor, their behavior, the way they breathed, their slightest gestures, and the trembling in their hands gave them away. Andreas was clearly convinced that their behavior was exactly as if they were hiding something. The team begins to take turns loading into the wagon. They decide that they need to make a trip to the village right now, because things are definitely not easy with this request. The coachman, who is driving the wagon, whips his horses to run even faster. The cart is pulled by two fast horses. They pass along a path in the deep woods, and the dust from the wheels can be seen from under the cart. The 5 men of the team are sitting in the wagon. Andreas continues to remain detached. Christopher asks everyone about the fact that shouldn't the first thing they do upon arrival be to find a place to stay? They have the investigation as their priority. The rest is not so important. Andreas stares absent-mindedly out the window. He realizes that the whole affair is suspicious, but for now they can only discreetly check everything. The curator turns to everyone and says that the landowner's castle must be inspected first. Andreas feels something begin to happen. He puts his hand to his pendant. He doesn't immediately realize what is happening here. He clenched his fist tightly and began to realize that his mana had suddenly begun to waver. He tries to keep his cool without giving any sign of it, and looks at the people sitting across from him. He feels it getting stronger the closer they get to the village. Suddenly their wagon begins to shake. Their eyes fill with terror. They cannot immediately realize what is happening here. They start shaking in different directions. Hazar turns to the coachman and shouts loudly for him to pull away. Ivy's handler continues to sit there with a nonchalant face. Christopher looks out the window and addresses the coachman angrily. But when he sees that something wrong is happening to the coachman, he opens his eyes wide in amazement. The coachman looks terrible. His mouth is wide open and drooling. His eyes are bulging. He whips his horses with great force to make them run as fast as possible. They look terribly intimidating, too. Horses are rushing at breakneck speed. Everything is flying in different directions from under their wheels. Christopher turns to Hazard and talks about something being wrong with the coachman. They do not understand what is wrong with him. Ivy's handler suspiciously tries to scrutinize the coachman's face. She kicks her foot against the wall of the wagon with all her might so they can get out of there. The back wall collapses, but it gives them nothing. The wreckage of the carriage falls straight to the ground. The curator realizes it's too late. She peeks out of the wagon to see where they are going. She, standing in the doorway, turns to everyone and tells them to get ready to jump out of the cart immediately. Christopher yells in exasperation that right now they're going to smack into the gate. Vivian looks at the scene, peering out of the wagon, her gaze betraying no emotion. The wagon is shattered to pieces. Maddened horses are flying in different directions. The whole stair from the ground has risen and nothing can be seen. All the parts of the wagon are blown to pieces. Everything around starts to burn and crackle. The coachman flies a great distance away. The coachman's frantic gaze is directed at the creatures beside him. Pretty girls in dresses are doing some dance-like movements. The coachman continues to lie on the ground with some madness going on around him. They pay no attention to him and continue dancing. Christopher tries to pull Hazard out of the overturned wagon. They look on in amazement. Everyone has climbed out of the wagon. They try to catch their breath and look at what's going on here. They can't understand what they are all doing. The villagers have just gone crazy. Crazy-looking horses are mad, baring their teeth and making moaning noises. Andreas's gaze is filled with disdain. He's staring at everything that's going on and can't look away. Hazar wrinkled his face, not quite happy to be watching. The unknown creatures with glowing eyes still continue to move as well. Their arms and legs are twisted. From their mouths, drooling hands, their eyes and hands pointing high toward the heavens. It's as if they're screaming something. Their mouths are wide open, their hair developing in different directions. Christopher turns to Andreas and asks him what's going on here. What's wrong with these villagers? He reproachfully reminds him that he is a mage and should know all of this. Andreas begins to guess what's going on here. He realizes that everything makes sense now. That what happened in the beginning with his mana in the wagon wasn't just an anomaly. A blue light begins to emanate from his chest area. He realizes that his mana is reacting this way, which means it's all black magic. It was already quite dark outside. The wrecked wagon flew straight into the fountain. The distraught townspeople in the square around the fountain are still dancing. From a bird's eye view, you can see that the entire village is starting to be engulfed in green light. It all looks very gloomy. A young boy with distraught eyes is staring somewhere. His mouth is wide open, drooling. His pupils are red in color. Suddenly, Vivian grabs him and knocks him face down to the floor. The boy grits his teeth and stares down at them in horror. Vivian sat on top of him and twisted his arms behind his back. Everyone else is beside them. Hazar leaned over and regarded him with interest. Vivian concludes that he is stronger than the average child. The guy's gaze is directed at them, smiling madly, tears streaming from his eyes. Hazar examines this boy's foot. He realizes that he has been dancing all day. His feet are in a terrible state. He talks about it being just as he thought it was, a curse. He turns to face Christopher, holding the boy's foot in his hands, and asks him about the fact that there must be some connection between their assignment and this curse. Christopher replies that the landowner has been gone for about a month. If they had been dancing all that time, they would have died of fatigue long ago. Andreas supports Christopher's version and says that it looks like someone is making sure they don't die. Christopher looks at Andreas with a slightly detached expression. He senses some kind of trick from him. Ivy's handler brings a hand to her forehead and concludes that they've probably been dragged into something problematic. Vivian continues to sit on the boy's back, twisting his hands behind his back so he can't move. Andreas reflects on the fact that his character didn't die here in the game. He thinks back to the butler's words. He begins to think that if they had accepted his offer to rest at the castle and travel on to the next one, things would have turned out differently. He began to fantasize about them relaxing in the castle, taking alcoholic drinks and enjoying the goodies. Andreas realizes that if they had stayed in the castle, the Baron would have hidden what was happening from them, but they immediately arrive in the village and the situation is different. They have gotten into something dangerous. Remembering Heron's enraged face, he decided that the mana he sensed was roughly at his level, but using it on such a scale seemed strange. The distraught villagers still continue to dance in the square around the fountain. Andreas opens his eyes wide and can't believe he has the artifact. Christopher, seeing that Andreas has a frightened face, asks him what's wrong. Andreas says that they know too little and suggests that they search the landowner's house first. They go for the first step, which is called information gathering. A dark night stands over the village. The bright stars in the sky are visible. The team approaches a huge, gloomy building. It is the landowner's house. In front of it stand the bodies of people who are burning in the fire. They stop and stare dumbfounded at this majestic building. The curator kicks in the front door of the landowner's house with a single kick. Armed, they try to cautiously enter the building. The curator and Hazar are the first to enter. The others stay outside. They begin to quickly look around the room from the inside. There are more windows with bars in the room. Walking a little further, they see that there are a lot of corpses lying on the floor. They are lying in different poses. Their faces are frozen with horror and their mouths are wide open. Their eyes are open, their pupils rolled back. It looks as if they are frozen, but they are actually dead. Ivy and Andreas's handler walks forward. Christopher stops and considers everything around him. He paused over one of the corpses and reasoned that their robes looked like imperial investigators. He leaned closer to the corpse and concluded that they had been dead for a long time. The rest of the guys from the team stand behind him and watch what he's doing. Andreas says with a nonchalant face that maybe they can figure out what's going on their own. The curator looks at him contemptuously, not understanding what he's saying. Andreas goes on to say that from what they saw, he thinks it's the work of a black magician. The curator chews on something and is asked on what basis he drew that conclusion. The creature is clothed in red. The only thing visible on his face are his bright, glowing red eyes. His fingers are swollen. He amplifies people's emotions and trades them for magical power. The curator says suspiciously that it is human emotion that feeds black magic after all. Standing across from each other, the curator says the landowner must have been killed as well. Andreas agrees with her assumption, because he would most likely have gotten in their way. With a sly look on his face, Christopher asks about what does it mean that the burning bodies in the street are part of some black ritual. Andreas is slightly startled by his ironic look. He looks at him and replies to him that maybe that's the way it is. The curator says that they will still only know the truth after they catch the criminals, and he says they need to search every corner of the estate first. They walk down the hallway. Everywhere they come across dead bodies lying on the floor. They decide to split into different sides to search everything as quickly as possible. Andreas is holding a tricycle with a glowing candle. He is holding a piece of paper of some kind. He lights one of the paintings hanging on the wall and scrutinizes it. The curator stands beside him. Vivian stands behind him, her face tight and tears welling up in her eyes. They are in one of the rooms of the manor. Vivian is looking out the window. They haven't found anything yet, not even the landowner's body. Vivian turns to Hazard and tells him to look outside. Andreas goes to the window and is amazed at what he sees. His mouth is open in amazement. Hundreds of villagers who danced on the platform are heading towards the landowner's palace where they are. Andreas realizes that the intruder is making his move. They wonder what they should do now. The people of the city are heading towards the palace with mad faces. Their eyes glow white. It's as if someone is controlling them. The team realizes that they most likely spotted them. It was as if they were waiting for them to go into the building to attack. Hazard hysterically asks Ivy's handler what they should do now. She can't find the words. She's thinking about the right thing for them to do now. Her voice is full of despair and hopelessness. She shouts to everyone that they need to stop the search and leave the building immediately. She points to Hazar to find them an escape route. Hazar instantly takes instructions and immediately goes into action. He runs at a high rate of speed in hopes of finding an escape route to avoid being caught by the distraught citizens of the town. Suddenly he stops and starts squinting, hoping he's imagining things, but it didn't appear to him. In front of him are hundreds of distraught townspeople. They attack him and he cannot fight them off. They grab his arms, their expressions frantic. Hazar screams and tries to fight them off, but he fails. They attack him from all sides. He has nowhere to run. Hazar is just above them, but that doesn't stop them. They push him so hard that they push him to the floor and he falls. Christopher and Andreas are standing there and they see him and run to his aid immediately. Christopher pushes Hazard away from the distraught townspeople who are attacking them. Pulling out his sword, he literally rips them apart. He swings and tries to defend himself. At that moment, he shouts to Hazar to protect the mage, meaning Andreas. At this point, he grinning shouts that he will take care of the front. Christopher urges Hazard to run and protect Andreas immediately so that the maddened people won't get to him. He was the only hope for salvation. Suddenly, Christopher notices something that discourages him. He freezes in absolute shock. The image of a furry monster that destroys everything in its path appears before him. Andreas's face shows streaks of blood that splattered directly into his face. The monster appears and attacks with unthinkable force. A yellow mist appears all around, and Christopher falls to the floor and can't get up. He doesn't have enough strength. It's as if everything is in a fog. Andreas is watching it all. Andreas becomes almost transparent, almost imperceptible. His eyes are dazed. He can't understand what's going on here. The unknown creature lies with its eyes closed and does not move. Christopher flew off with great force and hit his head on the floor. His face was bruised, his eyes were closed, and he was unconscious. Andreas crawls over to help Christopher by calling out to him. It's like everything is a blur. He can't see very well. His eyes are all split. Ivy's handler yells to him that they are still advancing and asks Andreas what he is doing. At this point, Hazard is dragged on his back without Christopher, who is unconscious. Ivy's handler grabs Andreas and throws him on his back. His eyes are closed and he is unconscious. Ivy's handler yells that they need to get out of here and turns to Vivian, pointing to the window. Vivian realizes, lightning fast, what is wanted of her, and with one swipe of her foot shatters the huge window in the middle of the hall. Ivy's handler is still dragging Andreas and Hazard is still dragging Christopher. They are both unconscious. Ivy's handler, holding Andreas on her shoulders, leaps out the window. The distraught townspeople continue to stand under the windows, hoping for an attack on them. They make a jump from the second floor and land on the ground. The curator continues to hold Andreas on his shoulders, and Hazard holds Christopher on his shoulders. His head hangs down. They rush as far away from the landowner's palace as possible, swearing loudly as they do so. They are running at a great speed. Andreas comes to his senses and turns around. He sees a whole herd of distraught townsfolk running after them. He realizes that he has fallen into a flashback from his last operation at the most inopportune time. A white magic ball appears in Andreas's hands, emitting a glowing field around him. It also remains on the back of Ivy's handler. He swings this ball at the distraught villagers running after them. Andreas throws this ball at the inhabitants, which forms an earth shield that allows them to escape. It restricts access to them. The curator at this point asks Andreas what's wrong with him. Does he not think he is alone? They also continue to move further away from the cultivator's palace. The curator at this point keeps telling Andreas not to waste his mana carelessly. He asks him if he can track the location of the black magician. They approach some low houses standing at the edge of the village. Andreas answers him that he can do it now. Andreas ponders the fact that this mage uses his mana so obviously he should have no trouble finding him. He proceeds with the ritual in such a way that he is completely immersed in himself and tries to feel where the black magician is in this way. A large number of others like him rush out and go lightning fast to seek out the black magician. Green streaks form around the circle. It helps you focus on your goal. You can see yellow flashes everywhere that look like cracked circles. Mana shines through all the rooms to determine where the black mage is. He shines a light on a barn-like building. No black mage is detected in it either. Andreas opens his eyes wide. He sees that the mage's location has been determined. They're aiming that way. Andreas reports that the black mage is in the house at 9 o'clock, about 100 meters away. The curator praises him. They rush at an unthinkable speed. They rush past the distraught citizens of the city. They fly off in different directions. Andreas asks Ivy's handler to stop, his hand trying to cover his face. The curator is heading with insane speed to where the black mage was discovered. She jumps all the obstacles with ease and rushes past the residential houses. They enter the premises of the house. An unknown person watches them through the window. The unknown man is the black mage. He has a white mask on his face. He has serious eyes. He didn't expect to be discovered so quickly. The curator kicks the door with all his might. The whole place goes to pieces. The door is lying at the curator's feet. The steel-long sword is already in her hands. She realizes that they have come right to the right place. Andreas, left outside the door, asks her about the fact that she absolutely has to kick down every door in the way. Suddenly, a purple veil appears in the doorway, where the door Ivy's handler had just kicked in. They remain separate rooms. There is a magical wall between them. The curator looks at it and realizes frustratedly that it was a trap. Andreas is desperately screaming. How could they have gotten caught in it so easily? Ivy's handler tries to touch the glowing wall. She realizes with horror that the black mage has so easily overpowered them. Damn! Behind her back sits a girl with a bloody mouth. She's all twitchy and shaking. She calls out to Ivy's handler, calling her sister. She turns around in horror to see an unknown girl sitting next to her. One of the girl's eyes is bandaged. Her eyes are falling out of the eye socket. Her mouth is wide open, her whole face and bloodied. She is cramped up, very cold and in pain. The curator looks at her in horror. She recognizes her and calls out Noah's name. At the same time, Andreas tries to break down the wall. He realizes that he can't do it. He tries to use some method, but all to no avail. Suddenly the words, "What a pity," are heard from somewhere, repeated several times. Andreas does not immediately understand what it means or where the sound is coming from. He hears this phrase more and more often, and doesn't understand what it could mean. Next, the phrase, "like moths to a flame," is heard. The word flame is repeated several times. He does not understand what all this means or who is saying these words. Andreas looks up and sees that a purple negative has formed above him, and a huge hole in the middle of it. This purple light starts to engulf everything around him into itself. He hears some sort of howl. He stares up into the sky with his eyes wide open. He is amazed at what is happening now, and does not understand what it all means. He hears words to the effect that there is no need for haste. Everything has been predestined by God. A voice urges him to bow down to idleness. Andreas's eyes went wide, his lips tightened. He didn't understand what the word idleness meant. Andreas looks dumbfounded. His lips are slightly tightened, his hands are down, his gaze directed downward. He doesn't understand why those words were spoken now. A huge golden cube is in the middle of a burning flame. In the middle of the cube is something that looks like a star. In the middle of the star is a stone that glows brightly. This game is called the Great Sin. A huge tree stands in the middle of the red flames. It looks as if someone has taken possession of it. Starting with the idleness, the 7 deadly sins have been separated from the main body, the Apocalypse manuscript. By collecting them all, the main boss can be summoned. Andreas is thinking about something. Behind him, the distraught townspeople appear and try to attack him. At this moment, Andreas only thinks about the fact that these are the most important subjects of the story. One of the distraught townsfolk, a girl, tries to grab his leg, but he skillfully leaps out and bounces upward. In the jump, Andreas thinks only about why the phrase is mentioned here, in a village that didn't even appear in the story. As Andreas tries to escape, someone's hand is pointed straight towards him to grab him, but he resolutely dodges it. At this point, he realizes that he can't do it alone and needs to team up with everyone else for now. Andreas is dragged along the ground, flailing his legs, one of the distraught townsfolk dragging him. He deftly tackles them and heads off somewhere in the distance with unimaginable speed. He runs away, leaving the distraught townspeople behind. It's already a dark night outside. This brings even more terror and fear to Ivy's handler squad. A huge sword slices the distraught townsfolk to pieces. Their bodies split in half and fall to the ground. Vivian, with red, mad eyes, just chops their bodies into pieces. They go flying in all directions. She's merciless. The look in her eyes is frightening. She's insane. Her eyes are bloodshot. She wants everyone dead and easily slashes the maddened townsfolk with her sharp sword. Andreas rushes in. He sees the whole scene and that Hazar is standing aside and the immobilized Christopher is lying on the ground. He turns to Hazar and asks him what happened to Vivian. Hazard turns to Andres and makes sure he's okay. He's alive. He talks about how he has never seen Vivian like this before. Andreas looks suspiciously at Hazard and thinks about the fact that he knew he couldn't trust a fanatic. He observes that an immobilized Christopher is lying on the ground. His entire body is wounded and his clothes are torn to shreds. He realizes that he can't leave his wounded ally alone and he decides to play along. Andreas indignantly reports that there has been a disaster. Ivy's handler is trapped behind the barrier. Hazar can't believe his ears and panics, asking what they should do now. Andreas again hears the phrase, "What a shame." It scrolls through many times. He still doesn't understand what it would mean. He hears the question, "Do you realize you're killing innocent citizens?" Hazard hears this voice too. A purple haze forms over them. Andreas tells him that it is most likely a black mage. Andreas looks at Hazard. You can see the disdain in his eyes. He tells him about the black mage. He must be near Ivy's handler. Hazard is crying hysterically. He realizes that she is in danger and tells Andreas that he is going to her and leaves the others to Andreas. Andreas looks at him with suspicion and disdain. Andreas looks after the departing Hazard and realizes that he is very easy to read, but it is better than betrayal. Vivian still continues to massacre the distraught citizens of the city. She still swings her sword desperately, tearing their bodies to pieces. Andreas looks at everything going on and realizes that none of this is good. He also realizes that it looks like the black magic is driving her crazy. If he moves, she will pull him into this meat grinder too. Vivian still continues to swing her sword vigorously as well, slashing the bodies of the city's inhabitants with ease. Andreas realizes with horror that she won't be able to dodge. His mouth is slightly open, his pupils constricted. Vivian looks mad. Her eyes are burning, and she swings her sword with such force that it doesn't end. Vivian easily impales the bodies of the distraught townsfolk. RNA massacres them with little effort. Vivian looks mad. She has a smile on her face and is laughing loudly. He watches it all with horror. Andreas looks at her and thinks about how it's a shame she wastes her material so thoughtlessly. He turns his head to the left and sees a black-clothed creature sitting on the roof of a building, with a hood over his head. He asks Andreas that he is the only one who didn't get hurt escaped. What will he do now? Andreas answers him that he doesn't care. The creature sitting on the roof is leaning on one knee. It tells Andreas that it is strikingly calm. The creature is a black magician. Andreas looks up and tells him with a nonchalant face that he thought it was a good time for the boss to show up. Andreas looks away from him. The black mage tells him that he doesn't know where he gets so much confidence from. His gaze becomes fierce and fierce. He holds out his hand to him and says that in recognition of his bravery, he will give him a trial. Andreas is flying into some kind of abyss. He doesn't realize what's happening. He didn't expect this to happen to him. His eyes are wide open. His hair is developing. Andreas is indignant. He doesn't understand what's going on here. His eyebrows are furrowed, his gaze filled with rage. He falls into some abyss. He is blessed with a red light. He realizes that he has been careless. He still continues to fly into the unknown. His eyes are wide open. He doesn't know what will happen next. He looks at his hand and sees that it's just slowly disappearing somewhere, disintegrating into small pieces. Andreas doesn't realize what's happening. His whole body begins to disintegrate into small pieces and dissolve into the unknown. Andreas's face begins to disintegrate into small pixels. He just watches what is happening and can't understand anything. Suddenly, he hears some kind of sound, as if someone had pressed a key. He looks at his hands, can't believe what he sees. His hands are wearing the gloves he wore when he was a special forces officer named Makoto. He looks himself over and realizes that he is now not the character Andreas, but a real person. He's bloody. He is dressed in a military uniform. He can't understand what happened. Was it really a dream? He is sitting in a trench and he hears an incredible explosion happening behind him with tremendous power. Everything around him explodes. He's holding a weapon and can't figure out where everyone is. He has a backpack on his back, his helmet flying off his head from the explosion. He holds his head. It's splitting open. Blood runs straight to his eyes. He's heading into the unknown. His steps are confident and determined. He is trying to figure out where he is and what is going on here. Suddenly, his eyes widen, his pupils narrow, one eye already covered in blood. He sees dead people all around him. A strange creature with glowing eyes stands on a hillock. Everything around him is ablaze with yellow flames. He scrutinizes the man he knows in him. The man shouts, addressing him by the name Makoto and telling him to run away immediately. One of his arms is torn off. Makoto looks at the man in horror and realizes it's Shohei. He tries to call out to him. Makoto swiftly runs towards him to hold him back, but he falls straight to the ground. He takes him by the neck and tries to bring him back to consciousness. He screams at him, but he doesn't respond. His eyes are rolled back, his mouth is open, one part of his head is missing. Makoto is shocked at what is happening. He screams loudly and tries to bring Shohei to his senses, but he realizes that he is most likely dead. Makoto holds it in his hands and sees his face start to crack and disintegrate into pieces. Halfway through, he turns into a man with green hair. It's his father. Makoto holds the body tightly in her arms and can't believe it. Everything around her is crackling. There is a bifurcation of the man. One half is the character Andreas, and the other half is the soldier Makoto. His father holds out an engraved gold signet to Andreas. He tells him that as long as he has it, he will be recognized as the true lord of House Cromwell. Andreas continues to hold the split character in his arms. His father talks to him about not letting him drag him down anymore. He says that Andreas was happy together with Emmy. Tears come to Andreas's eyes. He is certain that his father is in front of him. He is discouraged and can't say anything. He completely transforms into Andreas, Makoto's image disappearing. Andreas falls back into the abyss. His arm tenses. He's back in the game. The black mage looks questioningly at what is happening next to him. He watches as a glittering ball forms in front of him. Andreas climbs out of it. The black mage is dumbfounded and can't believe his eyes. Everything crackles, sparkles, and flares. The black magician steps back rather quickly. Everything explodes and goes flying in different directions. The black magician is blinded by the bright light. Andreas is fully back. Shards of glass flew off all around him. He still didn't realize what had just happened to him, where he had been. The black mage looks at him and can't believe it. How was he able to come back? He asks Andreas how he was able to escape his curse of idleness. Andreas just stands silently with his eyes down. Shards still fly in different directions and fall to the ground. Andreas thinks to himself that he's had enough. He calls up the electronic scoreboard to find out what just happened to him. 100% of Makoto Kaneshiro and Andreas Cromwell's character synchronization level has been achieved. He has obtained the talent of fighting. This talent is exceptional. This curse of his idleness is just a game that simply simulates someone's injuries. He looks at the scoreboard and asks the black mage that the caster's abilities are insufficient. The black mage stops. He laughs and can't believe what Andreas just said and interjects him. The tip of the sword could be seen, black flames issuing around it. The sword is aimed at Andreas, but he manages to dodge it. The whole place explodes. Andreas looks confidently at the black magician and asks him what he's going to do now. He tells him that it would never work on someone like him, having received special forces training. The black mage mutters something to himself. He is very angry with Andreas and realizes that he is helpless. The black mage viciously shuts him up. He throws a magic sword at him to nail him. Andreas flies away from the explosion that came from the sword strike. As he flies, he notices that Christopher is sitting unconscious nearby. The blast is aimed at him, but he bounces off and flies away. He manages to escape. Andreas stops and realizes that he's not that strong, but he can't do it without the use of the mantle. Andreas breaks his foot sharply. A dead body lies beneath his feet. He turns back around and sees that some kind of black magic ball has formed behind him. Andreas stands in front of the dead body and sees that no one is watching what is happening. The black mage jumps off the roof, with Christopher sitting unconscious beneath him. Andreas looks at him from a little farther away. The black mage stops and with a menacing expression asks Andreas who he is. Andreas says he's going to show who he is right now. A blue glowing ball of light forms in his hands. He calls up an electronic scoreboard and summons a skeleton. His facial expression portrays complete confidence. The black mage stares questioningly. His eyes are wide open, his pupils constricted. The electronic scoreboard says that 23 corpses have been found. Andreas's skill level is insufficient. 9 corpses will be activated. The dead citizens of the city under Andreas's feet begin to resurrect, turning into ugly skeletons. The electronic scoreboard reads that the skeleton summoning was successful. A black mask appears on Andreas's face. His eyes have turned red. Behind him stands his army of animated skeletons. They crunch with every movement. The black mage cries out in horror, "Necromancer!" He looks at them with undisguised anger and asks Andreas about the fact that the congregation has already found out what he's doing. Andreas looks at him angrily and becomes convinced that there is indeed a congregation of mages here. He laughs. He continues to convince himself that the black mage has gotten it all wrong and he can use that to shake him off his trail. 7 ordinary skeletons and 2 soldier skeletons were summoned. They stand behind him and wait for orders. There is a satisfied grin on Andreas's face. He tells the Black Mage that he has been entrusted with the return of the Page of Idleness in the name of the congregation. The Black Mage raises his hands to the top and forms black magic circles and flames. He asks Andreas that he will only fight skeletons. The angry skeletons are on the attack. Their mouths are wide open, eager for retribution. The Black Mage uses several black swords. He asks Andreas what he thinks he can do with the power of idleness. His swords head straight for the skulls of the skeletons. They crumble into small pieces. A terrible spectacle is taking place. The swords fired by the Black Mage fly straight into the skeletons and chop them into bones. Everything is on fire and burning. Andreas looks at it with horror. He didn't expect this. Andreas forms an earth shield in front of him. Swords fly at him and pierce it, but don't reach Andreas. The Black Mage yells at him to stop screwing around. He feels his advantage over him. Andreas directs magical mana to the side, summoning Nickel, his chief assistant, to his aid. Black magical streaks form around the Black Magician. He talks about how these skeletons are just gnats to him. Andreas, hiding behind an earthen shield, turns around and sees someone's hand gripping his sword tightly in his hands. It is the skeleton Nickel he has summoned. Nickel jumps up and heads for the Black Mage with all the fury he can muster. Andreas still sits in his hiding place. The Black Mage looks at him questioningly. His gaze expresses slight consternation. The unbelievable is happening. Skeleton Nickel tears apart with his sword the spears of darkness that the Black Mage released. The Black Mage's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this wretched skeleton to be so strong and dangerous. The Black Magician holds a magical golden cube that emits a magical red light. Andreas stares wide-eyed at it. He can't believe his eyes. Nickel's defense against the Black Mage's sword strikes is excellent. His eyes are furious and red in color. He let out a wall of defense in front of him. The magical cube begins to disintegrate into several plates, still continuing to burn with a bright golden flame. Andreas continues to observe all of this. He realizes this page of idleness. The Black Magician thinks of the unthinkable that the likes of Andreas could force him to use his precious collection of the power of idleness. This magical cube starts to create huge hands with long claws around it, which try to grab Nickel and Andreas. Everything around it burns with magical purple fire. The Black Mage unleashes sharp spears at Nickel and Andreas, while saying that Andreas will pay with his life for interfering with his plans. A multitude of huge hands try to hit Nickel and Andreas. Everything around them glows and burns. Nickel skillfully dodges the blows. When they miss, they hit straight to the ground. The blows make everything around them explode. Andreas dodges the punch and leaps away from it. He looks behind him, his hands clenched into fists, very angry. He realizes that at this speed he still has time to react. He's glad that Nickel is strong enough to withstand his attacks. Nickel swings his sword skillfully and sharply. He is a true professional. He outruns all the blows and dodges the Black Mage's attack. The hand that was released by Black Mage is actively trying to grab him. Nickel manages to avoid it, though. The Black Mage is enjoying watching the action. The Black Mage stands there looking at all of this. He has a puzzled look on his face. He shouts for the one to die in silence. Andreas looks at all of this and realizes that the Black Mage's attacks have become even stronger. Everything around him flames and explodes. He dodges the Black Mage's blows. He realizes he has trouble controlling the force, which means he hasn't fully mastered the powers of idleness yet. Andreas tries to get close to Nickel. He advises him to get to his blind spot and destroy him. Andreas is behind the skeleton, who is waving his sword angrily. Andreas tries to call out to him. The Black Mage's spear strikes Nickel directly. Everything burns and explodes from the impact. It destroyed him. The huge hands that the Black Mage had released stops and dangles motionless. The Black Mage looks on admiringly and realizes that he has won. He has destroyed the skeleton. Andreas holds onto his shoulder and continues to head towards him confidently. The Black Mage thinks about how very persistent he is. Andreas walks towards the Black Mage and smirks. He says confused that he only got Nickel and he destroyed him. The Black Mage looks questioningly at Andreas. His eyes are wide. The giant hands that were released by the Black Mage are lying on the ground unmoving. The Black Mage holds a glowing magic cube and laughs at Andreas. He says that it is his fault, but advises him not to worry. The Black Mage holds a glowing figure that has disintegrated into plates and tries to point it at Andreas. He tells him that he will send Andreas after Nickel. Huge hands with long claws came to life and headed straight for Andreas with more force, trying to grab him. Andreas looks at what is happening. There isn't a drop of fear in his eyes. He is absolutely sure of himself. Suddenly, the skeleton Nickel appears behind the black mage. The man senses that something is not right here. He realizes that there is someone behind him. The sharp sword of Nickel's skeleton swipes the head across the black mage's entire body. His eyes go blank in an instant, pupils constricted. Andreas watches as the black mage splits into two halves. Skeleton Nickel just chopped him in half. Andreas looks up at the sky, the purple negativity dissipating. He wonders who could have arranged all this. Nickel and Andreas stand silently looking at the black mage's chopped-up body. It lies immobile on the ground. He is finished. The black magician's mask had fallen off. Andreas had never imagined that the Baron's butler would turn out to be a black magician. Andreas remembers the wary face of the butler. He immediately sensed that something was wrong. He looked very suspicious. Andreas concludes that the Baron is also somehow involved in all this. Near the black mage's immobilized arm lies a glowing cube, still emitting a bright light. Andreas takes this cube in his hands. It still continues to give off a bright light and does not fade. Andreas holds the cube in his hands and doesn't know what he should do with it. He can't just walk around with such a valuable item. The 7th chapter of Diligent Idleness comes. The mana recovery rate is 321%. Suddenly, Andreas realizes that there is still Nickel to give this magical artifact to. He turns around and Nickel is standing behind him, all his bones crunching. Andreas hands the cube to Nickel and tells him to take care of it. Nickel continues to cringe, but he smiles. The light from the magic cube disappears. Nickel replies to Andreas that he will put it in the summoning vault for now and think about what to do with it later. Nickel disappears down the magical corridor. Andreas looks around and sees that the barrier is not falling. He wonders if the caster is dead. Why isn't it falling down? Vivian still continues to massacre the town's distraught citizens. She's chopping everyone to pieces. Andreas thinks about leaving everyone behind and walking away. But at the same moment, he dismisses the thought. He realizes that he will have to explain to everyone what happened and how he survived. Andreas touches the barrier, which looks like a huge black marble stone, with his right hand and realizes that this barrier is different from the one he was in. Suddenly, he senses something wrong. Something inexplicable begins to happen to him. His eyes widen with shock. He feels the barrier start to suck him inside. It happens very quickly. Only his legs remain outside. Andreas is completely engulfed by the black barrier. There's not a trace of him left. A little girl is staring dazedly somewhere. She is dressed in a lace dress and socks with a thin headband on her head. Her eyes are full of terror. She is trembling with fear and terror. She looks at the red chair and sees that it is moving as if someone is sitting on it. She can't believe her eyes. Andreas's ghost is sitting on a chair. She doesn't see it. She only hears it. At first, she thinks the chair is talking, but then she realizes that someone is sitting on the chair, either a ghost or a demon. The ghost recognizes in this little girl the features of Vivian Belkin. He replies to the girl that he is not a ghost or a demon. The girl still stares in horror at what is happening, but cannot see anyone on the chair. Who is speaking to her? Andreas replies to her that he is a fairy. He talks about how he has come to save her. The girl looks questioningly at the chair and doesn't say a word. She dazedly can't take her eyes off the chair, arriving in utter horror at what is happening. Andreas thinks about how nice it all is, but what the hell is he doing? He reassures himself that he should be patient. After all, it's just a game. He's a fairy now. Andreas shows up at someone's house and sees little Vivian being punched in the face by some noble woman. He observes what's going on, but no one sees him. That makes his investigation a lot easier. He discovers that the woman who hit little Vivian is the wife of Count Belkin. He watches little Vivian's family from the sidelines and learns a lot about them. Count Belkin sits on his horse. He looks noble. He has a thick beard and mustache on his face. The Belkin family is known for its mastery of the sword, so the Lord wished for a son who could be his successor. However, as the mother gave birth to a girl, tragedy struck. The mother is sitting on the bed and little Vivian is standing beside her. She brings her mother some food but knocks the tray over. She looks guilty. The mother looks at her furious, her eyes filled with hatred for the girl. She asks why she gave birth to her. The mother screams at her that she better not have given birth to her. The poor girl stands and stares at her. She is silent. Her eyes are pouring with tears. Her lips are tightened. Little Vivian runs away in tears. Since even her own mother has abandoned her, she has no one left to protect her. The unhappy girl grew into a soulless adult woman. The loneliness and cruelty she endured planted the seeds of madness in her. Vivian remembers being subjected to metal shackles. She was bound hand and foot, her throat bound by thick shackles. She was completely helpless. The more time passed, the more she gave into her madness. She takes great pleasure in killing people. She takes great pleasure in seeing them bleeding, screaming. Vivian is standing bloody on a mountain of bodies. In her hand she holds the head of one of the boys she killed. Her eyes are on fire. She is insanely happy in this moment. She enjoys it so much that she killed all the teachers and their assistants at the assembly for the 5th year. Andreas comes back to reality from his thoughts. Little Vivian still continues to look at him, tears in her eyes. She is about to cry. Andreas tries to comfort her while telling her that he really wants to help her. Andreas looks at the girl, a look of regret in his eyes. He goes on to tell her that he can help her try to overcome her past so that it doesn't bring her so much pain. Tears rolled from little Vivian's eyes. She cried loudly. She can't believe he really came to help her. She squats down and eagerly tries to see who her savior is. She looks at the chair, but there is no one on it. But someone's voice asks her why she is crying. Wiping away her tears, she explains to the voice that no one has ever tried to help her. Andreas only thinks that he doesn't really know how to behave with children. Little Vivian is red with tears, but she can't stop crying. Andreas's voice tells her that she has a special talent. It's just that no one here has been able to recognize it yet. The girl froze, listening intently to what the voice was telling her. In the palace where the girl lives, a conversation continues between little Vivian and the voice of Andreas. She doesn't believe that she is special, but Andreas tries to convince her that she is. He claims that she has a very special talent for wielding a sword. The girl continues to sit on her knees in front of the chair. She looks at her hands and doesn't understand how this is possible. She has never even picked up a sword before. Andreas, sitting on the chair, reassures her and tells her that the fairy knows many things. Little Vivian has already recovered from her tears. She sits in complete confusion. She says that she is always being scolded. Andreas replies to her that it's okay. He will always be there for her now. She stares mesmerized at the chair. Andreas asks her that in return, she promise him that she will never tell anyone about him. The girl silently agrees. It is a warm, sunny day. At the palace where Vivian and her family live, she promises Andreas that she will not tell anyone about him under any circumstances. Andreas accompanies little Vivian everywhere. When her mother shouts at her again, he stands by her side and comforts her, tries to cheer her up, and asks her not to pay attention to her. Andreas urges her to start practicing with the sword. Little Vivian grows up. She begins practicing swordsmanship diligently with her teacher. She's very good at it. She's holding a shield and learning to defend herself. In her other hand, she holds a sharp sword. Even as little Vivian sleeps, her sword lies beside her, and Andreas carefully guards her sleep and sits beside her at her bedside. It's a hot, sunny summer. The foliage is colored green. Summer is passing. The leaves on the trees begin to take on a golden hue. It begins to get gradually colder. A month passes, and Andreas accompanies little Vivian everywhere. Little Vivian strides determinedly across the grass in her long boots. She walks through the park and calls out to Andreas, calling him a fairy. She can't find him anywhere. She says loudly that she has come to the promised place as they had agreed. Andreas hides behind a tree, arms folded across his chest. He can hear everything. She continues to ask loudly if he will teach her swordsmanship today as well. She looks around, trying to find him with her eyes. Andreas peeks out from behind a tree and admonishes Vivian. He says you can't shout about it everywhere. Little Vivian covers her mouth guiltily with the palm of her hand. Andreas stands in front of her and reminds her that he said no one is allowed to know his identity. Vivian rubs her forehead in confusion. She giggles and tries to steer him away from the subject. She's glad he's found himself. Andreas announces with a serious look that the training is starting. The girl resolutely shouts that it is time to start fighting. Andreas thus spent a whole month with little Vivian. Little Vivian learned to hold and wield a sword with confidence. She began to take great pleasure in wielding the sword. With Andreas's talent of battlemanship of an exceptional level, he tried to give her as much advice as he could as soon as he could. Little Vivian's gaze became much more determined as she learned to stand up for herself. This advice suited her perfectly. She began practicing with the sword with great pleasure and fanaticism. It became the main business of her life. Growing up, Vivian didn't give up doing what she loved to do. Every day, she improved her skills in swordsmanship. She is truly a true genius at her craft. Andreas watches admiringly as little Vivian trains. He is amazed that such movements shouldn't belong to a child who only started sword training a month ago. Andreas comes out from behind a tree and tells little Vivian that he now understands why she was praised by her sword teacher. The girl casts her eyes downward. She's upset about something. Her head is downcast. She is silent and does not answer him. Andreas steps closer to her. Little Vivian tries to say something but can't make up her mind. Andreas looks at her and is perplexed. Up until this point, he thought she was a pretty confident kid. Vivian walks up to the fence. Andreas is standing behind her. He tries to ask her what's wrong, why she is suddenly sad. After all, her movements are perfect. She answers him sadly that it doesn't matter how many times he praises her, because he will never show himself to her. Andreas stiffens at those words. He had not expected that little Vivian would become so attached to him and that she would want to see him so much. He tries to find the words to explain himself. His eyes run in different directions. He's confused. Andreas tries to explain why he is a fairy. The girl, without listening to him, replies that he doesn't show himself to her because she is a bad child. She clutches the sword tightly in her hand and goes on to say that she thought that if she tried, and she would be recognized. She still stands with her back to Andreas and says she tried so hard. Just a little more and she cries. Andreas stands behind her and watches, unable to find the words to comfort little Vivian in any way. She stands with her eyes down and asks him if it's all so futile, no matter how hard she tries. Suddenly she hears a native voice. It is the voice of her father, Count Belkin. He walks behind, approaching Vivian, and says that he is very surprised by what he saw. The girl stands there with her eyes bulging. She doesn't know what to do or where to run to. Andrea stares in astonishment at Vivian's father approaching. The girl turns to him, a sharp sword in her hand. Count Belkin stops and tells her that he didn't expect his daughter to have such talent, which she has hidden from everyone. The Count asks little Vivian to demonstrate her sword skills once more. The girl still stands there with her eyes bulging. She quickly agrees to his request, unable to refuse her father. It is a beautiful fall day outside. There is not a cloud in the sky. Little Vivian practicing in the park near her home. The girl wields her sword very professionally. All her movements are controlled by her. She swings the sword without much strain. Her face expresses contentment. She is trying to prove to her father that she, too, is worth something. She is trying to win his approval. Little Vivian has finished and stands silently looking at her father. She is proud of herself. She stands and waits to hear what her father has to say. As expected of little Vivian, everything went flawlessly, for she has Belkin blood in her. The Count says approvingly that it was splendid and walks off in the direction of the palace. Little Vivian looks after him. Her sword is still in her right hand. She certainly hadn't expected praise from her father, her eyes rounded, her cubes clenched. Andreas stands behind Vivian and looks at her without saying a word. The girl turns to Andreas, still staring after her father as he leaves. She says this is the first time her father has ever praised her. She looks sad. Andreas stands behind her back. Little Vivian hears some kind of crackling. She talks about how she never dreamed of such a thing. Finally, she smiles. Andreas looks questioningly at little Vivian. He can't utter a word. A now adult Vivian stands in front of Andreas. He has a stunned look on his face. She tells him that she really wishes she could stay with Mr. Fairy longer, but it's time for her to wake up. Tears come to Vivian's eyes. She struggles to keep from bursting into tears. Everything around her cracked and shattered like brittle glass. Andreas watches all of this and realizes that she is finally awake. The glass completely cracks and shatters, only reality remains. Vivian tells Andreas that thanks to him she has found a path worth following. She smiles shyly. Lowering her eyes slightly, Andrea stands silently opposite her. She lets the sheet out of her hands and continues to say that it's better for her to follow this path rather than get stuck in the past. Andreas looks at her approvingly. He is glad that he was able to help a little girl find herself. Andreas slowly walks up to Vivian and addresses her seriously. He holds out his pinky finger to her, she gives hers. Their fingers intertwine. He says, "Our promise." She remembers that she made a promise to Mr. Fay that she would never let up. Andreas asks her to keep that promise forever. They stand holding each other's little fingers. Everything around them rattles and shatters, only they are illuminated by a bright flash of light. She tells him she will keep her promise, always. Vivian continues to hold Mr. Fay by his little finger and speak words of gratitude to him from the bottom of her heart. The splinters around them crumble away. He showed her a good dream that she will surely follow.